Our next speaker, Flick Gray, you'll see as soon as Flick comes up that I've actually lent her my hair for the day. She's an extraordinary person. She's a researcher, a trainer and a consultant and a supervisor, and has some insights that I'm really delighted that she'll be able to share with us today. Her talk, Open Dialogue for Australia, I invite her to come and speak to you now. Thanks very much, Flick.
I too want to acknowledge the traditional owners and the elders past and present. It's great to be back in Australia. And also I want to acknowledge the elders of the MAD movement, whatever you want to call us, and I think Sandy's definitely one of those elders who's made it possible for what I do. Other elders include Simon Champ, Marinda Epstein, Kath Roper. I don't know if these are names you know, but they're people who have inspired me and created space where I can do what I do. I'm going to share a little bit of what I do. I always have to make up titles for what I do. I'm a bit jealous of people who, you know, if someone turns to them in the, I don't know, on an aeroplane and says, "What do you do?" And I'm like, I wish I could just say nurse or something. Yeah, I do lots. I'm basically forging a path for myself. And actually, just before I get started, I told Sandy I would say that she's going to have books for sale. So, got to get that one out. So, what is open dialogue? And I'm just going to flag, I am very passionate about open dialogue, but it's certainly not the only thing out there, and it's certainly not for everyone. It's also one of those things that it's in danger of becoming a little bit of a thing that, you know, there's people who do open dialogue and people who don't, and I really want to resist that. Particularly, I think there's something about open dialogue that is very, very old. I think this is how communities have responded to people in distress for a very long time. I just think some of us have to learn how to do this because we've learnt other ways. So, what is open dialogue? One of the ways I like to explain it comes from a colleague of mine, Mia Kurti, who is she's Finnish, she's a family therapist and nurse. And she says, imagine if a mum comes to a mental health service and says, "What's wrong with my daughter?" And I don't know what other people's experiences are like, but often mum is told pretty much, "Go away, we'll deal with your daughter." You know, mum might be asked to give a little bit of information, she might be given information, but pretty much the mental health system takes over. And what's wrong is often answered with diagnosis, medication, hospitals, these kinds of service responses. What open dialogue instead does is it says, "I don't know what's going on, but let's sit down and understand together." And it's not that we don't know anything. Our, professional training does give us some tools, but also people's networks, people's social networks also know a lot about people. And so open dialogue is about bringing all the different voices into the room and talking about what's going on. Let's try and understand this together. So it's a way of responding to people in distress or crisis, and it's based on engaging people with their social network. I use this word social network to be as inclusive as possible. It does often mean family members, or it might mean people who are supporting that person in various ways. So they've got a homeless, a worker who's in homelessness, or a drugs and alcohol worker. It can be whoever's involved, whoever might be useful to have involved. A lot of the meetings happen in people's homes. They don't have to. People can meet wherever they'd like, but there is a sense of responding to people where they're actually in their natural environment rather than taking people out and putting them in very artificial environments. I'm also just going to flag, by the way, this PowerPoint will be available, so if at any point you feel like there's something worth writing down, by all means do, but don't feel pressured to. So open dialogue offers an alternative to the standard sort of diagnosis, hospital, medication route. Although these might all be considered, they're just not the first thing that has to happen or the default. So what it actually looks like is it's structured around a series of network meetings. So, and it brings together the people who are in crisis with their social networks, often family, and at least 2 therapists. The idea of having at least 2 therapists is so that you can hold the uncertainty and the risk and the difficulties much more, that there's just more people to help hold that. And in fact, the more crisis or the more difficulties, the more complexity, often you'll actually have 3 therapists. You can have more therapists involved. There's no referral or assessment needed. So it might be that a mother calls in distress and the response is, who should we bring together to talk about this difficulty? Or it might be a teacher or a son or whoever. So you don't have to go through a path of determining, is your crisis of the kind of crisis that we respond to? It's very much a no wrong door response. So the open part of open dialogue, nothing is said about the family or network behind their backs. So there's no kind of going off and talking about the family and working out who's the problem and where the problems are and formulating things and writing up lots of paperwork. None of that. It's actually everything is done with the network. Every decision is made, every conversation. So for example, there may be conversations about medication. Would it be useful to consider medication? Let's talk about this. And questions are asked which open up new ways of thinking. So it's not about coming to decisions very quickly. In fact, it's about opening up and trying to really hear all the different voices. And so, for example, if someone's very quiet in the network meeting, someone may turn to them and say, I'm wondering what it is that you're thinking about what's been said here. And it's incredible to watch. I've been involved in lots of network meetings where there was one that comes to mind where it was a young man who was experiencing psychosis, his mother's best friend, and his best friend. And his mum's best friend had known this young man his whole life. And I just think we don't have that in a regular service, the idea that mum's best friend might actually not just be, she wasn't just included, her opinion and her thoughts were actively encouraged and actively sought because she knows things, and also because she's slightly removed. She has a certain perspective that is not quite as caught up in the turmoil. The dialogue part is a way of being with people, listening, responding to utterances, so not interpreting everything and not trying to find symptoms or not trying to sort of interpret everything, actually just responding to what it is that people are saying. Encouraging polyphony, so polyphony, this idea of lots of voices, so asking lots of different people what they think. So it's not about coming rapidly to a consensus, it's actually about everyone really, really being heard. And also that polyphony can be internal, so it might be on the one hand I'm thinking medication might be really, really useful right now, but on the other hand I'm also thinking da-da-da. So individuals, polyphony, multiple voices are all encouraged. The idea is that new meanings and new understandings come about. So crises are usually complex. There are usually lots and lots of things going on that are difficult to disentangle and often difficult to find a language for. So it's not about solving problems, and I think often in the mental health system we try to draw up sort of what problems can we solve when we don't actually sometimes even know exactly what it is that's going on. Like, we don't allow space for more and more uncertainty. There's almost this push to have recovery goals or to have treatment outcomes very quickly. And some of the literature that they talk about problems being dissolved. So over time, the problems actually, solutions emerge through the network talking and figuring out things. So it's not about sort of listing problems and solving them, it's about actually the problems change and that people's understandings of them move over time. So a brief history. It's pioneered in Finland, in a very small area of Western Lapland, beginning in 1984. They've been researching it since 1988. Incredible amount of research has come out, which is part of why open dialogues come into the international scene, is because they've just researched it a lot, and there's actually a lot of evidence that it has incredibly good results, which I'll get to in a minute. A lot of what I call veterans, the people who really pioneered it, are moving on, or they're running training Markku Setälä passed away. He's actually part of the reason I went to study it, because I thought, oh, I want to study it before all of these veterans, pass on. So there's a first wave. So Finland, Norway, Lithuania, Estonia, Sweden, a whole bunch of countries that have started working in this way. It's spreading quite rapidly around the world. Germany, there's a lot of areas in Germany. The US, so the New York Parachute Project, Massachusetts, Vermont. In the UK, the NHS is running a massive trial with 5 areas taking up open dialogue. It's also evolving, like it's not something that we all have to do it the same way the Finns did it, because Finland's a very particular culture, it's quite rural, there's a whole lot of social determinants, Tornio didn't have peer support, and in places, particularly New York and London, peer support workers are integral, particularly in urban environments where people might not actually have much of a social network. They might have lost contact with, over time and actually not have anyone around them. And so peer support workers can often have a function to be a peer network. And like Sandy said, as drop-in centres have often been, or there are spaces where people can build some community. And also mindfulness has been introduced. The training's been condensed to 1 year in some places. It's 3 years in Tornio. So what are the results? Consistently incredible results, but the studies have been mainly naturalistic research, so it's looking at one group of people who are using open dialogue and then trying to compare them with people who elsewhere have had another approach, rather than a randomised control trial where you systematically divide people up. There is a randomised control trial being set up in the UK at the moment. But the results are so impressive that a lot of people around the world are thinking, it can't hurt to try this, it cannot. The current system is turning a lot of people into chronic mental patients, is failing a lot of people. And I say chronic mental patients not to judge the people who are in that position, but to judge the system that actually isn't responding to people's needs. So you can see, this is from one of the studies, 82% of people after 2 years having mild or no symptoms. This is after a first episode psychosis. The main thing that people point to is that a lot of people go back to some kind of meaningful occupation, come on to work, study. They actually get on with their lives a lot more so than in other environments. And much, much lower use of neuroleptics. It's not that medication's a bad thing, it's just that our system completely over-relies on it. And so neuroleptics are, constantly talked about. Is this useful? Are there other things we could be trying? How much to take? When to decide to have conversations about coming off? All these kinds of things. So much lower rates of people becoming chronic mental patients. And I'm really interested in how this interfaces with the NDIS, which pretty much presumes that you have to have some degree of chronicity to get services, which I think is a very odd system when actually we want people to have rich, full lives. How do we kind of balance it? I find it quite confusing. But also in Tornio, the number of hospital beds are going down. So that's because people are being treated in the community, but also people are not needing hospitalisation. They do have involuntary hospitalisation as an option, but they use it so rarely because actually there are other options. So the history of my coming to be here today, I use this question because this is a really common way of starting a treatment meeting, is you say, let's talk about the history of how we came to be here today. And if I was able to be more dialogical, I'd love to hear from each of you, how many of you have actually heard of open dialogue, or if you're just at this conference and this just happens to be the a keynote, so you're politely sitting through it. For me, it really started in 2013. I saw a documentary. I'm guessing there are probably some people who have seen this documentary. It's on the internet now. It's about an hour and a half, and it's about open dialogue, and it's an incredible documentary. And I saw it in a room full of high-profile psychiatrists like Pat McGorry, and also a lot of what I'd call ratbag psychiatric survivors, people who are really critical of the system and really vocal about their critiques. And there was really generative discussion in the room. And then about 2 weeks later, I did training for a day with a guy called Will Hall. If any of you have heard of him, he runs Madness Radio. He would be one of those ratbag psych survivors. He's from America. And he studied a 2-year course in America, run by Mary Olsen, which is based on open dialogue. And then in 2014, I don't know if any of you got to any of these talks, Markku Setula and Jaakko Sekula, who are two of the founders of Open Dialogue, did a tour of Australia and they ran some training for 2 days or 4 days, auspiced by ISPS, which is the International Society for Psychological and Social Approaches to the Schizophrenias. Anyway, ISPS ran this. But what I was really struck by was the similarities between the environment that Will Hall created, and Will Hall's incredibly critical of the dominant model, of the medical model, of mainstream responses, and the environment created by, Jaakko and Markku. Jaakko's, in fact, I think they're both psychologists, but they're the people who run the mental health system in this area of Finland. And one of the things that really attracts me to Open Dialogue is it actually brings together mainstream, like there are a lot of psychiatrists that I'm studying with, there are a lot of social workers, OTs, carers, peer workers, all these different voices are actually able to come together and all be really respected and heard, and it also is also the mental health system in various places. So for example, there are parts of the NHS where if you seek help, this is what you receive. I haven't come across other things. I'm someone who's been searching for better ways to do things for a very long time, and I've come across a lot of marginal, exciting spaces, but this is the first thing I've come across that is the mental health system and does actually manage to bring together all the different positionalities in a way that's very exciting. And then later that year, I read about that there was a 3-year course being offered. So this is the first time there's a course in English. It just happens to be in London. And I applied and got accepted in. So there's 3 peer workers out of 30. So 3 designated spots for people who have a lived experience. And so then began the insanity of, in fact, I'll just add this. There was a special edition of the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Family Therapy. Lots of other people in Australia are also interested in this, obviously, or else this journal. But then, I've been flying backwards and forwards to the UK every 3 months since then, often a bit jet lagged, but incredibly exciting to be part of this. And then late last year, I was awarded a Hocking Fellowship from SANE to go look at what's happening around the world with Open Dialogue. Particularly, I'm interested in the intersection with peer work because that's my background. And also, I kind of think that peer work is exploding and is fabulous and amazing. And I say peer work, I actually mean both carers and consumers. My background is as a consumer, but this is a space where all these different voices are really valued. So this is my crew back in London. There's a new space opening up called Open Dialogue UK, which is an independent group of people offering open dialogue, and that's where I'll be working when I'm in the UK. There are some people in that photo who have been very influential in the Hearing Voices movement. There's some of the people from Finland there. There's me grinning. I'm glad you can't see it too well, it's a bit dark. So that's the sort of triumphant story of Open Dialogue. Yay, Open Dialogue! But I do also want to honour the less triumphant part of it and the desperation that actually underpins it for me, and I know for a lot of people. So on Monday I was at a conference for peer-supported Open Dialogue. So in London they're calling it POD, so Open Dialogue but with peer support, so peer-supported Open Dialogue. A carer whose name is Annie Jeffrey explained that she trained in peer-supported Open Dialogue because she believes her son would still be alive if her family had been offered this. So there's a lot of people who are drawn to this approach because the current system's failed them in various ways, and I think particularly family members are often really drawn to this because it doesn't just include family members, they are absolutely integral to the process from woe to go. And in fact, the idea of who is the designated patient, it's not this kind of sense of this is the person who has difficulties and the rest of us are all fine, but it's also not the whole network's wrong and bad and needs. It's actually this idea that everyone has a voice in this and everyone has something to bring. The family is seen as a resource, not as a sort of pathology, as the family are the problem, or that the family are irrelevant and should be kept out. It's actually the whole, and I say family, but I mean the whole network. So it might be, I was thinking about Team Sandy, for example. Who's in Team Sandy? How can we bring them together to speak? So my experience with this is it's funny, I say 2005 was when it all started, but it didn't. That's just when the mental health system caught up with me, and my suicidality was turned into diagnoses and medication and psychiatry and la la la. I had very traumatic experiences in the mental health system. I understand myself as a trauma survivor. I had a traumatic childhood, and I understand my experiences through that lens, but the mental health system had all sorts of ways of responding or not responding that were really traumatic for me. And I've struggled for many years to find useful support. I was interested to hear Sandy say she's high maintenance. I have 2 psychiatrists and a therapist and a GP. You know, we make a wonderful team, but I am definitely high maintenance. And I've spent many years travelling the world, a lot of it online, but to try and find alternatives. So really driven by this question of what is it that I've needed and what could possibly have responded more usefully to my struggles. And I also just want to share, I've just said my own recent experience because I wasn't sure how comfortable I'd be to share this, but I think I am. Last week, a friend of mine, I'd been in contact with her quite intensively. So it's someone I have a peer support relationship with / friendship. I mean, it's quite blurred, but I'd been talking with her at length, and she was acutely suicidal. We had a long conversation, and during the course of the conversation, the police knocked on her door because someone had called the CAT team, and she was taken to hospital, and she was very, very distressed by this. And we exchanged emails while she was in hospital, and she was basically felt like it was really missing the point. Like she was having this huge existential life crisis, and they kept saying things like, "What exactly is the problem at work?" And she would answer, "I would rather die than go back to my work." And there was this real pressure to kind of have specific answers to the kinds of questions. And we'd talked about, I said to her, I'm really sorry, I've got a big shiny hammer called open dialogue, so of course I see nails everywhere, but I wonder what it would look like to bring your network together. And she said, "It's funny you say that, I've actually called a friend and asked if she'll come in and if we can have a meeting in hospital." And instead she was discharged because the hospital had other ideas, and within 3 hours she'd taken her own life. And this is just last week. So it's sitting very, very raw for me, this sense of the people who are let down by the current system. Actually, if there's ways in which we can bring people's networks together, I trust that those networks can support people in a robust way, and that the mental health system can have a place in that. But this structure whereby we remove someone, and I can remember, I was on the phone when the police came and she was screaming because she did not want to go to hospital. It's not been a useful experience for her before. And in fact, she's often found it traumatic. I think that sense of invalidation of speaking and not being heard in the way that she needed to be heard. This is very personal for me, trying to find ways in which someone, I still think, what could it have been like if we'd been able to get people together around this young woman who was struggling with all sorts of experiences. So the influences on open dialogue, I'm not going to go through all of these, but there's a whole lot of different influences. It's quite philosophical in a lot of ways. I've got this last one, Carol Atneve's work with shamanic practices. In a lot of ways, as I said at the start, this draws on really basic human ways of responding to distress. You get together the people who know what's going on, who might be useful to talk about what's going on, and you talk. And Caroline Atneve's work, she talks about, we've been doing this for 10,000 years, we need retribalisation. There's all sorts of influences though. Need adapted treatment, so that's the idea that you meet people where they are rather than designing a system and expecting people to fit in with the system. And I know we all say, no, we all have person-centred care. Hasn't been my experience. I certainly think witnessing the ways in which need adapted treatment is actually structured. Specifically, I'm thinking about, Mia talks about the person who answers the telephone. There's no secretary who answers the telephone. There's no kind of intake worker or anything like that. It's actually the person that you speak with is the person that you will then meet with in the dialogue meeting, so in the network meeting. So there's actually psychological continuity. And that the person who's got the phone, they take it with them to the bathroom, they take it wherever, whenever that phone needs to be answered, they answer it. And there's this really deep sense of course we respond to people as they need it. There's no sense of making people wait because the service is very full and we have a waiting period. There's none of that. It's a really incredible sense of actually we respond to people as needed. Sometimes that means that they meet with people for 3 hours and then they do that again on the same day. So there's this incredible capacity for intensity that I think most services go, oh, we can't do that. It's like, but if that's what people need, how can we not think about designing services around what people actually need? Particularly with open dialogue, what happens is that people have an intense need at the start, but it tapers off very, very quickly. So for example, people might only end up having 6 meetings, but 3 of them are in the first week. And then actually their needs are met and they're actually able to come together in different ways and support people, rather than the kind of ways in which people can stay on disability pensions, on, with carers being completely, their life being taken over by caring responsibilities. Actually people's needs are met. And this last one, the most influencing thing, and this is Markku, who's a Finnish speaker, so I've left his Finnish words. The most influencing thing has been the feeling of comfort and uncomfort. One of the things people who espouse open dialogue often talk about is this frees up workers as well to actually be really honest about what's happening for them, and if workers are uncomfortable with something, they can name that too and say, I'm concerned that we're moving too quickly, we haven't actually addressed this thing, and actually everyone in the room is encouraged to attend to if there's discomfort. Speak that, pay attention to that. Rather than having to do forms or sort of other ways of managing discomfort by sticking to structures and systems. Social network perspective, I've flagged this. It's the idea that these aren't individual experiences. When someone's having a crisis, it's not just that one individual who's in crisis, that it's completely within that person. It's actually a whole network that's impacted and that can influence what's going on. People live in their connections, people are actually social beings. This idea that we take people out of their environment into very sterile, strange environments is quite unusual when you think about it. The family network invited to attend meetings from the very beginning. Of course, some of you may have questions about what if there's, conflict in the family, trauma in the family, violence in the family. These things can all be talked about. People don't have to be in the room if people don't want them to be there. There are discussions about who to have in the room, and risk and violence are taken very, very seriously, but there is the idea that we bring everyone together. Families and networks are resources, not the problem, and everyone's voices are considered and heard. Even mum's best friend, if she's there, her voice is absolutely as important as anyone else's in the room. So it's not the psychiatrist is really the most important. It's actually, no, everyone. And also the voices of people who aren't there are also considered. So what might so-and-so say if they were here? First contact is really important, and it really structures the way the whole system operates. So rather than being met with, do you meet our criteria? Another part of open dialogue, as I said before, it's no wrong door. So if someone has problems with drugs and alcohol and they also have problems with homelessness, there's no sense of kind of we are the wrong service. It's always let's bring together who needs to be here. And the kinds of questions are things like, what are you worried about? Who knows about these concerns? Who might it be helpful to involve? Are there any troubles with sleep? Sleep is a really big one that they talk about right up, because sleep is one of the things that often goes haywire when people are in crisis. And so actually often sleep medication is the first medication that they think about, and just think, maybe if we increase people's resources by actually, attending to sleep. How urgent is the situation? And that's dependent on, how much can this network bear? Does this feel completely unbearable, or do you actually feel like you can sit with this for another week and see how it goes? So it's a real question, how urgent is this? Who should be invited to the first meeting and where should we meet? They're the kinds of questions. And these are some of the key words. Needs adapted, as I said, and it really is needs adapted. Like, it's so incredible having witnessed another way of doing things, coming back to Australian systems and realising how much we put the system's needs ahead of people in distress's needs. Invitations, not referrals. So there's no kind of sending people off somewhere else, but you might invite various people to come and be part of the network. So someone might say that, if there's difficulties with drugs and alcohol, maybe, we invite someone from drugs and alcohol services to come and be part of this. Maybe they'll have something useful to offer. Noticings, I love this. One thing I noticed and was curious about, so rather than knowing this is what is going on, there's not this sort of sense of certainty, it's a sense of, but you can pay attention to what you're noticing. Worries, so ownership of these worries. So for example, if a worker is worried about something, a worker is worried about something. It doesn't mean there necessarily is risk or is, truth to whatever it is that they're saying. It's one truth, and it is spoken. Polyphony I've mentioned. Otherness, this is one of the most difficult bits, respecting the otherness of the other. We can't know for sure what another is meaning. So we each speak, but we actually don't know for sure, and we can try and come to some kind of consensus about how to move forward, but knowing that actually we're all going to have slightly different perspectives. So for example, mum might think that dad's a bit pushy, and dad might think that actually he's really caring and loving and, hands-on, that mum's a bit hands-off. All these different meanings, so you don't have to figure out who's right. You will come to some kind of, how do we move forward from here? But it's not about convincing anyone that there's one truth. And the responsive, being responsive is another key word. And this is a quote from Buckton: "There is nothing more terrible for the word, and therefore for a person, than being without a response." Certainly that's been my experience with the mental health system, is often I've been in crisis and there's no response. The CAT team, sometimes famously called the Can't Attend Today team. And I know for a lot of family members that's the case. They're actually really concerned for someone and there's no response to that worry. And it's also about responding to the actual words. So if someone says, "I'm really worried about da-da-da-da-da," it's not reinterpreted as, "Oh, so there's a psychotic thing or there's a delusion." It's actually, no, what are the exact words? And in that way, people feel heard and are actually more able to explore exactly what it is they're thinking. I think I'm coming to time, so I'm just going to share some of these phrases. This is not what you get in the textbook. These are the kind of things that strike me from what some of the trainers have said. Kari Voltanens, he's a psychiatrist and family therapist and one of my trainers. He works at Karapudas Hospital in Tornio, so he's one of the elders. He talks about seeking to embrace the crisis. So crisis is not seen as something that is bad and that we should try and avoid. It's like when there's a crisis, there's an opportunity that actually things move differently in crisis. And if you can respond in the midst of that crisis, things can change in a way that they won't in other contexts. So the way that we often respond to crisis is there are massive waiting lists, which means you actually lose that opportunity to respond in crisis. He also says we'll see people as long as it is needed. So there's none of this kind of you have 10 sessions and then we're done, or you have to, you've got 12 months and then we're done. And so often what that means is that there'll be an intensity for a certain period and then it might drop off and you're not discharged, or, the service is still there if you need it, and maybe there'll come another time where you need another few sessions. So there's this real sense of actually being available to people as needed rather than structuring a standardised kind of number of sessions. Critical life issues in mental health distress. I love the Finns kind of stringing together words in a slightly unusual way. But these are critical life issues. I mean, yes, a lot of people do understand their experiences through the lens of mental illness, but even those who have the most biological understandings, there's still life issues that surround what's going on, and still critical discussions about meaning making and about life that discussion within the network can really enhance understanding of those. Mia also says, "I just wanted to say this because it is on the surface." What that is that people are really encouraged to say if something's really striking them or is really there, to speak it, to trust that actually there's a reason why it's there for you, rather than kind of trying to second guess, is this important, is this relevant, is this what I should be saying at this point? It's like, if it's there, speak. There's probably a reason. This is from Val Jackson, who, she's a family therapist, she's the lead trainer at the pod training. She says it's about moving from an expert position of knowing to a not knowing position. And that's from the perspective of clinicians, really trusting that they're not the expert in this networks, that they have some expertise. It's not to it's not to ignore the expertise that you have, but to also acknowledge that you don't know a lot of things and that you have a certain understanding that might be useful, but that it's not the only understanding, and that actually part of your role is to hear everyone's understandings and to really encourage everyone's perspective to be heard. People deserve to know what we think. Again, this is Kari, so he's a psychiatrist. Part of what happens in a network meeting, there'll be a point at which the therapists might turn to each other and start sharing what's on their mind. And so they might say, I'm really struck by, when young Katie said, da-da-da-da-da, I really felt that in my body, and I thought, oh, goodness. It's this kind of process of actually sharing what's going on in your mind. So it's the open part is also this real transparency of sharing what you're thinking rather than going away and writing case notes behind someone's back. It's really transparent. The families consistently say this is the part that is the most useful to them, is to actually hear what's going on in the minds of, and this is offered, Kari talks about it as like a plate of delicacies, a plate of tasty morsels, and the family will take whichever bits, so in a reflection there might be all sorts of things said, and some of it resonates and some of it doesn't for different people, and each person will just take which bits they find useful, rather than the experts coming in and pronouncing, and imposing that understanding on everyone else. This is from Jorma, who's one of the open dialogue trainers. I don't know what his disciplinary background is, but he's one of my trainers, so I probably should. How could I talk in a way that increases others' desire to listen? And how could I listen in a way that increases others' desire to talk? This is part of what open dialogue does, is that it encourages a way of being together so that everyone's more able to hear each other. And you hear families consistently talk about, after a few sessions, they're actually much more able to share with each other and to actually engage in a way that they're hearing things in a new way. Often the systems become stuck because certain patterns have sort of become stuck. People don't know how to move differently, and so creating this space means that there's just space for new movement, for new things to happen. But also people start to speak in a way that others might be able to hear them more, and also listen in a way that others are more able to speak, so really opening up space. And quite often there'll be people who haven't spoken for a long time, people whose experiences have led them to become quite shut down, not speaking. And this way of being, you do see people start to speak. Even if it's tiny little micro movements, there is just much more space for people to actually speak and be heard. So just to finish, open dialogue on the Australian environment. So big challenges. Number one, I see as training. It's 3-year training in Finland. I can't see that being, lots of people do all sorts of trainings, but it's 90% of their staff have this 3-year training. It's a very, very intense training, and they actually highly value that, and they say that this is an incredibly important part of what they do. And a lot of this training is reading some of the philosophy, reading narrative therapy, all the different kinds of approaches. In the US, they've taken it down to 2 years. In the UK, there's a 1-year diploma, which is, I think, what's likely to come to Australia. But also all the trainers are, I've said international, most of them are in Europe. So it's actually a really long way for them to come to do this training. We don't have any local trainers. We don't have people who are trained in it. People have done sort of 4 days, I think is the most. I've done 25 days or something. I'm just into my 2nd year. So this is, I think, quite a challenge if we do actually want to bring this style to Australia. Peer-supported open dialogue is also, it's a new element for Tornio. They have just started to employ peer workers. In the UK and the US, they're absolutely, and Germany as well, they're absolutely integral. And people often, so Dr. Russell Razak, and I didn't check how to spell his last name, that was one of the things I meant to do. That's how you say it, but I know that's not how you spell it, Razak. He describes the peer involvement as integral to keeping the process non-hierarchical and dialogical. So having carer and consumer peer workers in the room actually really changes the dynamic so that it doesn't become hierarchical, so that psychiatrist knows best. There's also significant variety between how well peer work is understood and valued. And I'd say, for example, under the NDIS, there's a lot of, so for example in Barwon, there's a lot of evidence to show that peer workers are being used as basically mini underpaid workers who do a lot of the sort of driving people to appointments, or, you know, a lot of the sort of really undervalued work, which I think is missing the value of what peer work actually can specifically offer. So I think there's some interesting conversations about how peers and carers are involved in this space. Transitional arrangements, I've called it. Basically, I mean the money. It's so much more resource intensive at the start, and most services just blanch at the idea of spending 3 hours and then coming back and doing it again and then meeting again and again. But it saves, like the research consistently shows that it saves resources in the long term, like significant resources, because people don't end up on disability pension, carers don't end up having to give up their jobs and, you know, stay at home and take care of their loved one. Hospitalisation, hospitals are really expensive. Like I'm still shocked at the idea that this friend of mine spent 3 days in hospital. I think if that money had been able to be used by her network, or, you know, by what kind of support could have actually been provided with that money. Hospitals are the most expensive part of the system, and yet we still keep structuring a system around, you know, people being in hospital. And no doubt you can think of many others. I'm sure there are other challenges that you're like, this wouldn't work here at all. I don't know. This is the last word that I've got from Val Jackson, who, as I said, was the family therapist lead, the POD training. If you can at least do nothing about them without them, it will radically change the culture. So this idea in open dialogue that nothing is done behind the network's back has been identified as one of the real key changes, so that actually everything is discussed in front of the network. And I don't know if any of you have read your case notes, if any of you even have case notes written about you. It's really strange reading what people write behind your back, how much of it is actually, I have a very different perspective on what was going on. And so this idea of there being one truth that is written, you know, that is described behind people's backs, rather than actually creating a space where truth is, you know, everyone's perspective is actually honoured and heard. So rather than this reification of one person's expertise or one group of people's expertise being the final word, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.